Chapter 1. Vey's Wish. Thordric's brow creased as he gazed at his notes, flicking through them with annoyance. He'd been working on his dishwashing spell for weeks, and though he'd cracked the first part to make the plates clean themselves after he'd finished eating, getting the magical lacquer to stick to plates that didn't come from the Wizard Council was proving far more difficult than he'd first thought. Unfortunately, it was the lacquer that made the spell work. It was composed of a special powder that, upon detection of cold waste substances, would force them all up into a great floating mass of muck, which then levitated itself into the nearest waste bin. Both practical and entertaining, Thordric had thought. But without a way to make the lacquer stick to normal plates, there was no way anyone other than the Council could use it. This was one of the reasons why Thordric's mood that morning was particularly grim. No matter how much he adjusted the ingredients or the mixing time, he still couldn't get the lacquer to like the feel of ordinary crockery. True, turning the powder into a lacquer was certainly a step up from when he'd tried to use it raw, which had either failed to work or made the mass of waste food fly at the diner's face. But it still flat-out rejected normal plates and dishes, despite there being no real difference between those and the Wizard Council's ones. Perhaps it was the magical residue left on the Wizard Council's plates that made the lacquer like them so much. He jotted the idea down in his notebook, but then realized that he also needed to find something that would rinse and dry the plates after the waste food had disappeared. Absently tugging out several strands of his thick dark hair, he thought back to all the trouble he'd had with spells before. There had been many times when he'd thought his magic just wasn't good enough, and in each case he'd surprised himself by making things work. But this time... No, he wouldn't let despair sink in just yet. He could do this. He was just stuck in a rut at the moment, that was all. The Wizard Council had been Thordric's home for 6 years now, ever since he'd helped solve the murder case of High Wizard Caljard, and revealed the High Wizard's terrible plans to eradicate all the half-wizards in Dinia. Even though Thordric was only 21, the youngest council member of all time, he was treated with respect by the council's new leader, High Wizard Vey, something that many of the older wizards still muttered about behind his back. Not to mention that, unlike most of the wizards at the council, both he and Vey were half-wizards, which had caused quite a stir when Vey had revealed this fact at Thordric's initiation ceremony, because thanks to Caljard's lies over the many years he'd been head of the Wizard Council, everyone had believed that half-wizards were dangerous and couldn't control their magic. Of course, it was true that full wizards came from families that had never had any magic in them before. Thus, they supposedly received all the potential magic of that bloodline, and half-wizards came from families that had already produced a wizard. But as to their magic being dangerous, Thordric had disproved that many times. In fact, he'd shown the council that the only difference between full and half-wizard magic was that full wizards were trained how to use theirs from an early age, whereas half-wizards received no training at all, and were left to work out things for themselves, sometimes with hazardous results. It was to put an end to all the prejudice against half-wizards that he and Vey had reformed the council, accepting half-wizards to be trained at the Wizard Council training facility just as early as full wizards. It had taken a lot of work, but now the hatred for them was dissolving, allowing the people of Dinia to live together, peacefully, no matter what their lineage. So now Thordric had much more time to focus on making new spells, which was why he'd started work on his dishwashing spell, trying to make a way for the busy people of Dinia to clean their dishes instantly, so they could spend time doing other things. A knock came at his door, making him jump and hit his head on the bookshelf above his desk. He yelped, and the door came crashing open to reveal Cal, the teenage wizard that Thordric had been put in charge of 3 years ago, staring at him with concern.
"Thordric, what happened? Are you—"
"I'm fine, Cal," Thordric grumbled irritably, rubbing his head. "Was there something you needed?"